What if I told you that once upon a time, there was a king so severely deformed that his own people whispered he had been cursed by the devil himself? Meet Charles II of Spain, a monarch whose appearance was so disturbing that even members of his own royal court believed he was under some kind of dark enchantment. They didn't call him El Hechizado, meaning the bewitched, for nothing. But here's the twist. Charles wasn't the victim of some witch's spell or otherworldly curse. No, his condition came from something far more real and much more horrifying. It was his blood. This is the true unsettling story of how the most powerful dynasty in Europe, the Habsburgs, essentially engineered their own downfall by turning their family tree into a circle. And the result? A king so grotesquely malformed that when he finally died, the autopsy findings were so disturbing that they seemed to confirm every terrifying rumor his people had believed for years. So if you're into royal secrets, twisted history, and stories your high school textbooks conveniently left out, hit that subscribe button, because we're just getting warmed up. 1. The jaw that couldn't close. Imagine you're a foreign diplomat meeting the King of Spain, the ruler of one of the most powerful empires in the world. You expect grandeur, poise, majesty. Instead, what you get is a man whose jaw juts so far forward that he can't even close his mouth. Literally, his lips don't meet. His mouth hangs open, slack, like a puppet with a broken hinge. It wasn't a birth accident. It was the product of 200 years of one of the darkest royal obsessions in European history, an obsession with keeping the bloodline pure. But let's call it what it really was: inbreeding. The Habsburgs followed one simple rule: marry inside the family to keep the power inside the family. Cousins married cousins, uncles married nieces. It got so ridiculous that at one point, someone could be their own cousin multiple times over. Let's talk about Charles's parents. They weren't just close relatives. His father was his mother's uncle, and both of Charles's grandparent pairs were also uncle-niece combinations. If you drew his family tree, you'd need to turn it into a pretzel. So what happens when you stack generation after generation of genetic copies on top of each other? You get the infamous Habsburg jaw, known to doctors today as mandibular prognathism. In Charles' case, it was extreme. His lower jaw stuck out so far that even when he tried to close his mouth, there was still a gap wide enough to slide a coin through. His teeth didn't align at all. The top row sat entirely behind the bottom row. He couldn't chew. Every meal was a struggle. To keep the king from starving, the palace chefs had to prepare everything as if they were feeding an infant: pureed vegetables, mashed meats, liquids. Even then, eating was a humiliating process. Soups would dribble from the corners of his mouth. Solid food would just fall right out. Imagine a royal banquet filled with nobles and foreign guests. And in the center of it all, a king drooling uncontrollably, unable to eat like a functioning adult. Worse, he couldn't speak clearly. His twisted jaw structure meant that every sentence came out as a wet, garbled mess. Foreign envoys couldn't understand him, not because they didn't speak Spanish, but because his words were literally unintelligible. Court scribes documented how even Charles' own mother, Queen Mariana, lived in constant fear that her son would choke on his own tongue while sleeping. That's how bad it was. The most powerful man in Europe was basically considered a choking hazard. And the worst part? The Habsburgs knew this was happening. They knew their family lines were producing increasingly unhealthy and malformed children. But they didn't stop, because power mattered more than their own children's well-being. By the time Charles was born, he wasn't just a king. He was the tragic product of what happens when human genetics are pushed way past the breaking point. 2. A body that defied nature, but the jaw, that was just the start. Charles II's entire body was like something out of a medical horror story, and it only got worse with age. At 35 years old, he looked like a malnourished child who'd been stretched out and warped by some cruel hand. He stood barely 5 feet tall. His body was alarmingly thin. His limbs looked skeletal, and his torso seemed compressed and hunched. And his head? Massive. It looked too big for his body, swaying around on a neck that struggled to support it. It gave him an eerie, bobble-headed appearance, one that freaked people out even in portraits. He didn't learn to walk until he was 8 years old. Let that sink in. Most children walk before their first birthday. Charles? He spent nearly a decade crawling or being carried because his muscles were so weak and underdeveloped. Even when he finally did walk, it was more like a shuffle. He would lurch from wall to wall, using furniture for support. Think less young king and more old man at death's door. Palace scribes noted how his spine was so badly curved that he seemed permanently hunched, like he was carrying some invisible burden. And in a way, he was. A mind trapped in a broken body. Charles's mental development was just as stunted as his physical body. He didn't learn to read until age 10. And even then, reading and comprehension were a struggle. His tutors described trying to educate him as like pouring water into a broken jug. Nothing stuck. Lessons would go in one ear and vanish. He had the emotional control of a toddler. Servants described violent tantrums over the smallest frustrations, screaming, flailing, kicking like a child denied a toy. These would be followed by hours of eerie silence, where he'd sit unmoving, just staring into the void. Even his hair betrayed him. It grew in clumps, thin and patchy, and often fell out. His scalp looked diseased, something closer to animal hide than royalty. Artists commissioned to paint his official portraits had to get creative, adding bulk, strength, and symmetry to hide the truth. But even the most flattering paintings couldn't cover it all. The damage was too extensive. And here's the most terrifying part. Charles wasn't just born this way. He was getting worse. While most people stabilize after puberty, Charles's body just kept deteriorating. His health declined at an alarming rate. Muscles weakened, organs failed, and no doctor could explain why. It was like his body was trying to shut itself down, piece by piece. 3. The king who couldn't make heirs. At the core of every monarchy is a simple expectation: produce an heir and continue the bloodline. It's the bare minimum. But Charles II, the king at the heart of the world's most powerful empire, couldn't do it. He married twice, both times under immense pressure to create a successor. But neither marriage resulted in a single child. The first was to Marie-Louise of Orléans, a vibrant, intelligent French princess. When she arrived in Spain, she expected to marry a king. Instead, she found herself wed to someone who, according to palace gossip, was barely a man. The wedding night was a catastrophe. Servants later recounted how Marie-Louise emerged from the bedchamber in tears, while Charles appeared confused, distressed, and unaware of what had gone wrong. The truth was harsh and humiliating. Charles was functionally impotent. The same inbreeding that had warped his face and body had also ravaged his reproductive system. His genitals, according to court doctors, were underdeveloped to the point of resembling a child's. He had the sexual maturity of a boy, a king whose own body prevented him from doing the one thing everyone was counting on, blaming the wrong person. But of course, in 17th century Spain, no one could openly say, the king can't have children. So they did what monarchies have done for centuries. They blamed the woman. Marie-Louise was labeled barren. Her body was treated like a royal science project. She was subjected to one humiliating procedure after another: herbal tonics, painful fertility rituals, medical inspections so invasive they bordered on abuse. She was told it was her duty to conceive, that she must try harder, that the fate of the Spanish Empire depended on her. But no amount of prayers, potions, or treatments could change the biological truth. The emotional toll was immense. Marie-Louise, once known for her wit and charm, became depressed and reclusive. She spent entire days in prayer, pleading with God for a miracle that would never come. Some historians even speculate that she may have been slowly poisoned, either by the stress, the relentless treatments, or even a palace conspiracy to remove her and try again with a different bride. At just 26 years old, she died suddenly under suspicious circumstances, and with no heir in sight, the Spanish court didn't waste time mourning. They quickly arranged a second marriage, hoping against hope that maybe this time they could fix what was clearly broken. A second marriage, a second failure enter Maria Anna of Neuburg, a German princess brought in to solve Spain's most pressing problem. But by the time she arrived, Charles was in his mid-30s, and his condition had only worsened. Maria Anna was horrified. In private letters to her family, she described her new husband's appearance with dread and open fear. It didn't take long for her to realize conceiving a child with Charles was not going to happen. Still, the court tried everything. They flew in doctors from across Europe, consulted ancient fertility texts, employed strange rituals. They even turned to magic. No joke, magic. Priests and healers attempted bizarre remedies. One physician reportedly suggested placing Charles under a specific moon phase while reciting fertility chants. Others proposed more invasive and painful options. At one point, Charles was subjected to medical examinations so demeaning, his genitals were inspected, measured, and poked in front of multiple physicians, all desperate to understand why they simply didn't work. But of course, the issue wasn't something you could solve with herbs or chants. It was in his DNA. The political clock was ticking. Meanwhile, the rest of Europe was watching, waiting, like vultures circling above a wounded animal. Everyone knew Charles would eventually die without an heir, and when he did, the Spanish crown would be up for grabs. Every major power had a claim. Every kingdom had soldiers ready to march. The storm was coming, and the irony? It was the Habsburgs' own fault. They had spent centuries building alliances through intermarriage, consolidating control, and keeping their dynasty airtight, but by marrying too closely for too long, they ruined their own genetic line. Charles was the final product of that obsession, the last inbred domino, a king who couldn't even perform the most basic duty of a monarch, fathering the next generation. 4. Exorcisms in the palace. With no heir, no progress, and no answers from medicine, the Spanish court turned to something older and more terrifying: exorcism. Yes, really. When doctors couldn't explain Charles' condition, when all the prayers, potions, and political strategies failed, the royal advisors decided he must be possessed. And so began one of the strangest chapters in royal history. The palace was turned into a spiritual battleground. Full-scale exorcisms were held in the throne room, not in private, but with the royal court in attendance. Nobles, foreign guests, clergy. Everyone was forced to watch their king convulsing on the floor while priests shouted Latin incantations and splashed him with holy water. The chief exorcist, Father Froilan Diaz, believed Charles was inhabited by not just one, but multiple demons, each responsible for different aspects of his condition. The rituals were brutal. Charles was made to drink holy water mixed with ground-up relics, including bone fragments of saints. Unsurprisingly, this made him violently sick. But to the priests, the vomiting wasn't a reaction to contaminated water. It was proof the demons were being purged. They pressed crucifixes to his skin until he screamed, forced him to recite prayers in Latin, a language he barely understood. At times, he would pass out. Other times, he would scream in pain or shake uncontrollably. It was horrifying. Purging the palace. But the exorcists didn't stop with the king. They became convinced that the entire royal residence was cursed. So they launched a full-blown spiritual cleansing of the palace. Servants were ordered to gather anything that might be tainted by witchcraft: personal belongings, furniture, old gifts from foreign nobles. These items were brought to the courtyard and burned in massive bonfires as priests chanted over the flames. To Charles, it all felt like progress. He was a deeply suggestible man, and after every ritual, when the priests told him the demons had fled, he'd feel temporary relief, less pain, more clarity, which only made things worse. Because the moment his symptoms returned, and they always did, Charles would beg for another exorcism, another battle with invisible demons, another session of spiritual torture disguised as salvation. A terrifying climax. Things reached a fever pitch in 1699, when Father Diaz declared he had expelled 47 different demons from Charles's body. Each had a name. Each was blamed for a specific condition, one for his jaw, one for his impotence, another for his seizures, and so on. After that final cleansing, Charles collapsed. He didn't speak for 3 days. His body was too weak, his spirit too broken. And all the while, the real enemy, the thing that had haunted him since birth, was not the supernatural. It was the very blood that flowed through his veins. 5. The autopsy that shocked Europe. When Charles II finally died in 1700, he was just 38 years old. Though his body had looked elderly and broken for years, Spain held its breath. The court was in mourning, but behind the black veils and funeral processions was a chilling curiosity. What exactly had been wrong with him? For decades, People whispered that Charles was cursed, bewitched, or haunted. Some believed he was born under a dark star. Others thought he had demons in his blood. Now, with his body lifeless and cold, doctors could finally look inside and find the truth. The autopsy report they produced was so grotesque, so disturbing, that it was almost immediately suppressed. The court feared it would confirm every horror story that had been whispered in the corridors of power. But the truth got out anyway. And when it did, it sent shockwaves through Europe. A body, rotted from the inside. The royal physician who led the examination, Dr. Geronimo de la Fuente Piñuela, left behind a medical document that read more like a horror novel than a science report. Let's start with Charles's heart. It was described as no bigger than a walnut, shriveled, blackened, and dry, like a piece of overcooked meat. A normal adult heart weighs around 300 grams. Charles's heart weighed less than 50. It was barely functional. Somehow, it had managed to keep him alive for nearly 4 decades. Somehow. His lungs were next, and what the physicians found there was equally grotesque. They were filled with fluid and gangrenous tissue rotting from the inside. The stench that came from opening his chest cavity was so foul that several assistants reportedly fled the room. The damage didn't stop there. His digestive system, stomach, intestines, liver, all showed signs of advanced decay. Gangrene, putrefaction, internal rot. The organs were black, swollen, and misshapen. Charles had been literally decomposing while still alive, and yet the worst discoveries were still to come. The truth about his reproductive organs. For decades, the court had blamed his wives for their childlessness. Doctors had examined them, priests had prayed for them, and advisors had humiliated them in public. But Charles' autopsy revealed the brutal truth. His reproductive organs were catastrophically underdeveloped. The official notes use phrases like infantile structure and non-functional. Essentially, his genitals had never developed into anything close to adult anatomy. There was no way Charles could have fathered a child. None. All the stress, all the royal marriages, all the political tension. It had been a biological impossibility from the beginning. Opening the skull. Finally, the doctors opened Charles's skull. And what they found there explained so much about the man who had ruled Spain in a fog of confusion. His brain was surrounded by an unusual amount of fluid, a condition we now recognize as hydrocephalus. The brain tissue itself appeared damaged, underdeveloped, and discolored. This single discovery explained decades of behavior, the delayed speech, the learning disabilities, the emotional outbursts, the inability to make decisions, the lack of comprehension. Charles had not simply been slow or simple-minded. His brain had been physically malformed. A body with no healthy organs. At the end of his report, Dr. Piñuela summed it all up in one devastating line. It is a miracle this body sustained life for so long, as it contained not a single healthy organ. Let that sink in. Not a single healthy organ. His heart was too small. His lungs were rotting. His intestines were decayed. His reproductive system was non-functional. His brain was malformed. Every part of him, every system that should have worked together to keep a human alive, was failing. The King of Spain had been dying from the moment he was born. Science confirmed the superstition. The most ironic and tragic twist? The autopsy was meant to dispel the rumors of demonic possession and curses, to prove that Charles's condition had a natural cause. But the findings were so extreme, so unnatural in appearance, that they ended up doing the opposite. They confirmed the fears. People said, only a man cursed by the devil could look like that on the inside. In a cruel twist of fate, the very science that was supposed to explain away superstition ended up fueling it. And then came the war. Charles II died without an heir, no sons, no daughters, no backup plan. The throne of Spain and its vast empire stretching across Europe and the Americas was suddenly vacant, and every major power in Europe wanted a piece of it. France, Austria, England, the Dutch Republic, all had claims, all had ambitions. Within months of Charles's death, the continent descended into one of the bloodiest conflicts in European history, the War of the Spanish Succession. It lasted over a decade. Hundreds of thousands died. Economies collapsed. Alliances shifted. Kings fell. Empires teetered. And it all traced back to one man, a king so broken by centuries of inbreeding that he couldn't do the one thing he was born to do: continue the dynasty. A dynasty doomed by its own obsession. The Habsburgs believed in blood, not just figuratively, but literally. They believed that keeping their lineage pure would keep their power absolute, that by marrying within their family, they could control their destiny. But nature doesn't work like that. By concentrating their gene pool generation after generation, they didn't create gods. They created Charles II, a tragic, malformed man who became a living warning sign of what happens when power is pursued at the cost of humanity. His jaw that couldn't close, his voice that couldn't be understood, his limbs that couldn't support him, his mind that couldn't mature, and ultimately a body that couldn't live. Charles II wasn't just the last of the Spanish Habsburgs. He was the symbol of a dynasty destroyed by its own ambition, its obsession with purity, control, and legacy. And in the end, biology had the final word. 6. A legacy that outlived the king. Even though Charles II's body was buried and his crown passed on, his story didn't end there. In fact, his death was just the beginning of something much bigger and bloodier. Europe was now standing on a knife's edge, because when Charles died without an heir, he hadn't just left an empty throne. He had left behind an empire: Spain, the Spanish Netherlands, Naples, Sicily, Milan, huge parts of the Americas, and more. This was the kind of prize that could tip the balance of global power, and suddenly everyone wanted it. The claims and the chaos. Charles' will had named Philip of Anjou, the grandson of France's powerful king Louis XIII, as his successor. On paper, it seemed like a smart choice. He was young, connected, and had strong royal blood. But here's the problem. Philip was also in line to inherit the French throne. That terrified the rest of Europe, because if France and Spain were ruled by the same dynasty, the House of Bourbon, it would create a super empire that could crush smaller nations like bugs. The Austrian Habsburgs, who were closely related to the Spanish Habsburgs, claimed the Spanish throne should have gone to Archduke Charles of Austria instead. Boom! Now you've got two rival kings, two royal families ready to fight. And the rest of Europe? They picked sides. Some supported Philip, Others backed the Austrian Charles. England and the Dutch Republic sided with Austria. France and much of southern Europe supported Philip. And just like that, Charles II's broken bloodline plunged the continent into the War of the Spanish Succession, one of the largest wars of the early 18th century. A decade of devastation. The war lasted 13 years. From 1701 to 1714, Europe turned into a massive battlefield. It wasn't just about kings and thrones anymore. It was about trade, colonies, territory, and long-standing grudges. Hundreds of thousands died. Cities were burned. Fortresses fell. Armies marched back and forth across Spain, Italy, Germany, and the Low Countries. Entire populations suffered, all because one man had been too sick to produce an heir. The irony? If the Habsburgs had simply married outside their own family, if they had allowed a little genetic diversity, Charles might have been healthy enough to do his job. Instead, their obsession with blood purity led to war, famine, and political chaos across an entire continent. The fallout. When the dust finally settled in 1714, the Treaty of Utrecht was signed, and it reshaped Europe. Philip of Anjou kept the Spanish throne, but he had to agree that France and Spain would never unite under a single crown. The Austrian Habsburgs received massive compensation, including control over Naples, Milan, and the Spanish Netherlands. England gained key strategic territories like Gibraltar and increased its naval dominance. The war had cost Europe dearly, but it had also ended the Habsburg dynasty in Spain forever. With Charles II, their line died out, and the Bourbons took over. A new dynasty had begun, but the scars left by the Habsburgs' downfall would take much longer to heal. Lessons never learned. You'd think that after watching an entire dynasty collapse under the weight of its own inbreeding, other royal families might learn a lesson. But old habits die hard. Even after Charles II, many European royal houses continued to marry within their own bloodlines. Cousins wed cousins. Second cousins were paired off like pieces in a political chess game. The results weren't always as extreme as Charles, but the patterns repeated. For example, the Russian Romanovs, the British royal family, and even Napoleon's family all engaged in various forms of strategic intermarriage, hoping to consolidate power or solidify alliances. And sure, some of those marriages were politically successful. But the genetic consequences? Still haunting. A genetic wake-up call today, we understand what the Habsburgs didn't. Inbreeding dramatically increases the chances of genetic disorders. When both parents share a significant amount of DNA, their child is more likely to inherit 2 copies of defective genes, one from each side. This can lead to developmental delays, physical deformities, cognitive impairment, infertility, higher rates of infant mortality. In Charles II's case, modern geneticists have analyzed his family tree and determined that his inbreeding coefficient was 0.254. To put that in perspective, it's about the same as being the offspring of a brother and sister. Let that sink in. Not first cousins, not uncle and niece. Sibling-level inbreeding. He didn't stand a chance. The tragic face of power. Charles II wasn't just a victim of genetic failure. He was a symbol of how far people will go to hold on to power, even if it means sacrificing their own children. He was never meant to be king. His body and mind weren't built for it, and yet he was crowned. dressed in royal robes and shoved onto a throne, expected to rule, to lead, to produce an heir. He couldn't even walk properly. But the Habsburgs didn't care. They propped him up like a puppet. They filled the court with sycophants who pretended nothing was wrong. They punished his wives. They blamed witches and demons. And all the while, the real monster sat quietly in the bloodline, multiplying with every generation. The portraits that lied. If you look up portraits of Charles II, you might be surprised. He doesn't look that bad. A little off, maybe. A prominent jaw. Some weird angles. But overall, he looks regal. That's no accident. Royal painters were under strict orders to make their kings look strong and noble. A painter who showed the truth risked being fired, or worse, so they worked their magic. They made his skin smoother, his jaw less exaggerated, his body healthier. They added muscle where there was none, confidence where there was only confusion. But even they couldn't hide everything. There's a blankness in his eyes, a sag in his posture, a heaviness in his expression that no brush could correct, because deep down, everyone knew. They were painting a ghost. 7. A warning carved in history. When you strip away the royal titles, the palaces, and the politics, what remains of Charles II? Second story is something eerily human, a cautionary tale that still echoes centuries later. Because Charles wasn't just a king, he was a mirror. A mirror that forced the world to look at what happens when power becomes more important than people, when bloodlines matter more than well-being, and when empires gamble with genetics to preserve a throne. His reign was a slow-motion tragedy, and his body became the final, undeniable evidence that even the most powerful families cannot escape the consequences of their choices. The myth versus the man over time. Charles II became more myth than man. He was the king who drooled at banquets, the monarch who couldn't speak, couldn't walk, couldn't father a child. The ruler so broken that priests believed he housed dozens of demons. The one who watched exorcists burn furniture and sprinkle holy water on him, convinced this was helping. People turned him into a caricature. They laughed, they recoiled, they pitied. But Charles wasn't a monster. He was a child born into a cage made of royal rules and centuries of genetic mistakes. He didn't choose his parents. He didn't design his face. He didn't ask to become the head of a crumbling empire, a time when his own organs were shutting down one by one. He was, in many ways, the ultimate victim of dynastic pride. When power becomes a prison, the Habsburgs believed they were building a legacy of strength. But they didn't build a fortress. They built a prison. And Charles was born into the deepest cell. In their quest to keep power within the family, they made that family too small, too tangled, too fragile. They believed that royal blood was sacred, that commoners diluted it, that only those with pure lineage could rule. But their definition of pure was tragically flawed, because what they ended up creating wasn't divine perfection. It was biological collapse. A king with no voice. Think about this. Charles couldn't speak clearly. Every time he tried to make a proclamation, people strained to understand him. His words slurred, muffled by his protruding jaw and his misshapen tongue. The king, the literal voice of the nation, had no voice. Decisions were made for him. Policies were drafted in his name, but rarely by his will. He sat on a throne surrounded by advisors, doctors, priests, and manipulators, all using his weakness as a ladder for their own ambitions. In the end, his rule wasn't just ineffective, it was puppeteered. A man with a crown, but no control. A body crowned with gold, but breaking down from the inside. The final irony, and here's where it all comes full circle. The Habsburgs spent hundreds of years trying to avoid disorder, fragmentation, and foreign influence by controlling their bloodline. They feared revolution. They feared chaos. They feared what would happen if someone unworthy took the throne. And yet, it was their very obsession with control that destroyed them. By the time Charles died, their line was extinct. Their empire fractured. Their name, once whispered in reverence, became a warning in the history books. The irony is almost too perfect. What we still don't talk about history likes to glorify monarchs. We celebrate their victories. We memorize their battles. We marvel at their crowns and castles. But what we often ignore is the human cost. Behind every throne are untold stories of children born into impossible expectations, of bodies pushed beyond their limits, of minds broken by isolation, pressure, and manipulation. Charles II was one of those stories. A man who lived in a world that saw him not as a person, but as a symbol, a vessel for legacy. No one ever asked if he was happy, if he was afraid, if he understood what was happening to him. And maybe that's the scariest part of all. Why it still matters. You might be wondering, why should we care? Charles has been dead for over 300 years. The Habsburgs are gone. Monarchies barely function the way they used to. But this story isn't just about royals. It's about what happens when systems value image over health, legacy over life, and pride over people. It's about the dangers of ignoring science in favor of tradition, the risk of clinging to power even as everything around you crumbles, the temptation to believe that we can outsmart biology, fate, or nature, if only we control things tightly enough. Sound familiar? In a world still grappling with ideas of purity, superiority, and bloodlines, Charles II is more relevant than ever. One last look. If you ever find yourself in Madrid, you can visit the Pantheon of the Kings, where Charles is buried beneath marble and gold. There's no fanfare, no grand statue, just a name etched in stone. A name that once ruled the greatest empire in the world, but could barely walk without help. And if you stand there long enough, you might realize this wasn't just a dead king. He was a warning, carved into history, buried under centuries of denial, and still whispering across time. Absolute power doesn't make you strong. It makes you fragile. If you're still watching, thank you for sticking with this dark, strange, and very human story. If you found this eye-opening, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and leave a comment below. What's another twisted royal tale you want me to dig into? Maybe the madness of King George? The missing Romanovs? Or the truth behind Rasputin? Let me know, because there are plenty more secrets buried beneath the crown. And trust me, history is way messier than they teach you in school.